New York under the title of assistant art director. It's kind of a title that covers a number of different roles that you can fulfill, such as a set designer, a concept illustrator. There's some graphic work you can be involved with, as well as being very involved with the construction process alongside with the art department coordinator and also the art director. So switching unions, it's a bit more, there's a bit more compartmentalization in terms of the roles. So I'm a set designer currently, titled set designer. Concept illustration is actually a separate role and a separate union card, which I intend to add at a certain point in time. But as a set designer, I've been working pretty steadily out here, getting to work on some cool projects. Like I spent a lot of this year working on Black Panther 2, doing sets and vehicle design work for them. Currently working on a Lucasfilms project. So kind of in the Star Wars universe, doing vehicle spaceship design for that. So kind of the full circle of all this is that, you know, you don't know which direction ultimately that life is going to kind of steer you in. You know, I initially kind of listened to other people's limitations of understanding in terms of a certain career or a certain industry, that is in film. And I took a different direction and kind of circled back around to this. And I think two things that I learned from that was it's very important that, at least in my belief, it's very important to stay true to yourself and to, if you believe or know something about yourself in terms of a career path or what you want to follow, I think it's very important that you listen to yourself and listen to your heart on that. Because no one else can understand it as well as you do yourself. And I think it's important to take advice but it's also important to stay the course with that. The other kind of lesson learned is that no matter what you kind of plan in terms of career, life has a way of kind of guiding you in a direction that you can't always completely steer, but it's very important to take advantage of opportunities. Like I was given many opportunities and had people that looked out for my success, and which is kind of where I've been able to get to today. But to make sure that when those opportunities come, that you acknowledge them, take them, and that you show up and do your best. And so I think that ultimately puts you in the direction, in the path that you want to be on anyway. So that's a bit kind of overview of kind of where I started off again in architecture and have landed in set design, and honestly getting to work on some of the projects that I kind of dreamed on working on as a child. And where the future heads is I'm still going to continue to follow that kind of path that gets, you know, kind of put out in front of me and take advantage of the opportunities and just give my best on it.
Brandon, you make me very proud. I'm sorry. I'm happy to hear everybody's story, but you make me very proud. Clint Ramos, will you please join us? Hi. And I will preface this with Clint and I went to school together.
I was just gonna say that.
We were classmates and ran down the hallways at NYU together, and dear heart. So I'm very happy to see all of your successes and very happy that you're joining us today.
As yours too. Hi, I'm Clint Ramos. I'm a lot of things. But how do we even start? Oh, let me start by acknowledging where I am. I'm in Tongva land right now. I'm in Los Angeles actually right now. But God, what is my journey? My journey was, you know, I was born and raised in the Philippines, right? So I'm an immigrant to this country, and you know, my early years here, my background is in the theater. I was doing a lot of street theater in the Philippines, like a lot of like political street theater, you know, like the stuff you do and then get you arrested, you know. And I was doing that very young, right? I was in boarding school in Manila, and I didn't come from Manila. I was like from the provinces, and you know, I cut classes to do all of that. So I'd always kind of like found that exciting, but more than anything, I was attracted to it because we were creating something that seemed like it was artistic, but also there was a community to it, right? And so I think that to me was the most exciting part about it. And I kind of like have chased that all this time. I've kind of chased that community, like, you know, through art. Like I look at my life, and I actually have almost all of my friends are from work. You know, I've worked with my friends, I've gone to school, you know, like they're all there. It's all about sort of like what I do, you know, and how I've defined myself through designing and working in the theater and film. And so it's never, I can't really compartmentalize, you know, my sort of like own self separated from what I do, right? And I've stopped doing that. Having said that, so I came here to this country. I didn't know what I wanted, but I just wanted to work. And so I started, you know, finding people who kind of like were like me, you know, who looked like me. And then just started doing work with them, like off Broadway, you know, like even doing, you know, like little, I worked at this theater called La Mama in New York. It's like downtown. There was like this like awesome like Black lady. Her name was, oh my God, Ellis Stewart. Just sort of blacked out. But Ellis Stewart was this amazing, like her story was unbelievable. Like she was this like seamstress in Chicago and she came to New York and she's like no artistic background, nothing, right? And she's like, fuck all y'all, I'm gonna start my own theater. I'm gonna start this, I'm just gonna do this. And she became sort of like this, like, you know, doyen of like downtown like theater. And like she's, you know, she's like a national artist in a way. But she established what had become sort of like this, you know, this kind of like path for me. I'm like, if she could, like, you know, look at her, like, look at what she's doing. She's literally like, you know, she's like convincing the city to give her buildings, and the city gave her buildings, and she would like, you know, create theater and like house all of these artists, you know, and forget about codes and everything. But like, you know, she was like doing her own thing. And I love that. I love that sort of sense that I could, you know, that I could empower myself that way. And then I went to grad school, and that's where I met Tony. And then, you know, all of a sudden it became sort of like this discipline, you know, we were, you know, it was all about like studio time. It was about, you know, just like studying the craft. You know, in hindsight, there were a lot of like really great things about grad school, but there were also a lot of like bad things about grad school. And, you know, we were just so lost in like the work, right? And you know, like your dreams start to like, you have these professors. I think one of the great things about like Tisch, where Tony and I went, was that we had professors who were working, right? And so, you know, we'd get these like notes from the field, you know, and so that was always helpful, kind of like to formulate, like, you know, to look at what we were dreaming. But, you know, for me, I never really, one of the things that I could never sort of like separate from my experience here in America was being an immigrant, and that when I moved here, all of a sudden I was brown. You know, I came from a homogenous country, you know, everybody looked like me. And so all of a sudden here, I was thrust into this thing that I had to navigate, you know, and a lot of the rules of this thing that I'm talking about is actually not written down. It's all unspoken, right? Like, although it's institutionalized by law, nobody actually says to you, oh, you know what? They're going to look at you sideways because you look like that and you have an accent or whatever it is. You know what I mean? Like, and I think so if anybody's listening to this that, you know, is like feeling that like it's real, it's not you, you're not, it's not here, you know, like racism is real, sexism is real, all of that is real. And yet there are people in this industry that actually love what we do and do, who look like you, who know that sort of path. You know, I think as Judy had said, I didn't have a mentor, you know, we didn't have like mentors. I couldn't really, I think part of the hard thing about mentorship is that I would want to actually look at somebody's, like, you know, there were so many, like I assisted a bunch of people, you know, but they didn't have the same lived experience that I did, because only very few did, right? Very few did. And those very few were working very hard, so they didn't really have time, you know, to sort of just like, you know, to be with us. In hindsight, I could have just like really hung on and just be like, let me just hang out with you, right? But I think part of mentorship was that it was never sort of fulfilling, because it was never, I could never see myself in their position, right? I could never see myself, you know, I assisted all of these successful people, but yet I always looked at like, oh, there are certain doors that like they're able to walk through that I could not. right? Through a lot of things, and I sort of like realized that, and you know, I think part of that is just like it's a sort of like rude awakening. So for me, a lot of my path was just really going to. I went to where the love it was, you know. I didn't kind of like worry about like I didn't worry about sort of like the math of it all. I just kind of like said, okay, these people are welcoming me. You know, these people value me. These people believe in the work that I do, and I actually, you know, and I believe in them. We all think alike. We all believe in the same things. We politically, socially, everything. So I'm just gonna hang out with them, you know, and I'm gonna create art with them, and sort of that's kind of like my journey. I mean, I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not gonna be like naive and lie to you and say that there were so many times where I just like said, oh, is this really the path for me, you know? And those times were like about money, you know what I mean? Where you're just like, you know, you're like in some basement and you're like, you know, you're like, you're doing all of this work for no money. And then, you know, you have colleagues or people who you went to grad school with who are like doing all of this work that like on levels that are higher than you, right? And you kind of like, for me, I could not see a path forward. And so it was just always like about head down, you know, and working, you know. I come from this immigrant mentality where I just like really looked down and worked, right? And a lot of that was really awesome and great, but a lot of it was really harmful, right? I have a really disproportionate, my relationship to labor is weird, you know. My relationship to self-care is well, first of all, it began as non-existent, and then now it's about, you know, I have to dismantle a lot of things that were programmed in me, you know what I mean? And so that's sort of like where I am now. I think, you know, I've done throughout sort of my career, I've done Broadway shows, you know, my journey into film has always been kind of like peripheral. Like somebody would ask me, hey, do you want to do this, you know, independent film? Do you want to do this thing? And I'm like, okay, cool. You know, I do that. And then, you know, Respect, which just came out, which you should also please check out, was my first like big studio film. I'd never done, you know, like I have a film that costume and production design, and it's out on Netflix, and it's a small independent film. And for some reason, I'm attracted to sort of projects that sort of breed community, you know, and it's hard for me to sort of like go into a project and feel like it's a job, you know. I always like, I always like, I feel like I'm still that like a young child in the Philippines, like chasing community, you know, chasing family. What can I say? You know, I think for me, I don't really have, I think for me, there was no template, there was no formula, there was nothing like, you know, people who said, oh, you know, like a lot of people would say, oh, you know, you need to work twice as hard, and you need to do this, and, you know, you need to, some people were like telling me to sort of advocate for my own stuff, and some people were telling me like, no, you know, you gotta head down, just like take it, you know. There's a lot of conflicting things, right? And then for me, I just really needed to find my own path and kind of like really distill what, you know, what felt right and what didn't, you know. And most of the time I kind of learned my path through that. I never.
Clint, can I ask a question of you?
Yeah.
In your journey and in your not having a plan,
yeah,
and in your really wearing many different hats. I mean, we may have different hats, but generally they're still in the same lane. And you've crossed multiple lanes, and maybe something more true to the theatrical or the older.
Yeah.
You know, could you speak a little bit to that aspect of your journey?
Yeah, I guess it's like, it's sometimes, I think all of us have gone through this kind of like thing where we like think about it. It's like, oh God, I'd like to do that. You know, I just kind of like said to myself, okay, let's try. You know what I mean?
For those that don't know, what are the different hats that you wear, sir?
So I design sets and costumes for theater. I production design film, I costume design film as well. I'm also a creative producing director. I'm a producer at New York City Center's Encores. I'm also an educator, so I mean, everything sort of revolves around, creating art, but it's always, I feel like, I think maybe it's because like, I feel like once I start really fully defining myself as something, then it feels like a job, and it feels like, because I think a lot of my identity is attached to what I do. It feels like I want to kind of encompass more things to kind of like to sort of approach that multiplicity of my identity. I'm so many things than one thing, and I've kind of, it drives, I think, people don't know what to do about that, right? Like, I would have like agents tell me like, oh, you would be really, really more successful if you just did this one thing. And I didn't, maybe, but it never, I just like, it just would come up and I would need to scratch them. And that's sort of like how I would, I kind of like approached it. In terms of the producing stuff and in terms of like really getting on an institutional level, a lot of that was really prompted by like, like we there's so many conversations about like, who are the gatekeepers and who are we letting in and all of that kind of stuff. And for me, it was a pragmatic way to say, hey, listen, if I am actually in that position, then I can actually affect change. I can let more people in, and I can, so perhaps even by me doing, I can provide some sort of template on how to do it, right? Like, so, this is my first tenure at New York City Center, and you kind of just, I'm excited about the possibilities of what we can do. I think for me, it's been such a great journey to show the institution like, no, you actually can do this. You actually can hire these young designers, particularly young women designers and designers of color. And we don't need to look at a long resume. I always, there's this Filipino saying, and I'm just gonna say it in English. It's basically, it says, its translation is basically, trust somebody and they become trustworthy, right? Hire somebody and they become hireable, right? So it doesn't work for me. I think a lot of us like think, oh, it's the opposite, right? Oh, we have to like hire somebody who is trustworthy. We have to hire somebody who's like really hireable, right? But to me, it's the reverse. The power of actually just like hiring somebody, they immediately become hireable. If you know what I mean? Like
That's a word. That's a word. We're gonna knit it and we're gonna embroider it and put it all over 829. How about that?
but to me, so a lot of like that thinking, it's exciting to like to sort of put that into practice and on an institutional level, and also like, like, hey, look, we've done it here. We're walking the walk and we take it seriously. Because sometimes there's so much talk about EDI right now, you know what I mean? But like, I think one of the things that's really important for us to realize that EDI is not necessarily social justice, and so, God, I'm getting derailed, but that's sort of like my journey. Like, like I want to get to the questions because like, I could talk about things, but like, I think for me, like there's never been a template, right? And one of the things that really frustrated me was that there was no template, right? Like I would be like, oh, fuck, should I just like go into like this field? Should I go into law school? Should I just like, and so early on, there were so many like pulling, like, and a lot of it was because of a fear of insecurity, right? Like a really deep fear that I will somehow like not survive, right? And to me, there are so many ways that you can approach that, right? And one of the most important things that I did coming out of grad school and was really to keep my overhead low, like super low. Like I lived in the boroughs. I rented like a half a room. Like, you know what I mean? Like I needed to do that because for me, it was more important to practice, like I just needed to keep on practicing. It is a practice. Like what we do is a practice. It's pretty much like, martial
And
arts.
I'm gonna stop you because you're gonna keep preaching all night. So let me
Are
tell
we?
you. No, it's great. We're gonna move on to Marina because I can't wait to see what Marina has. Marina has some images that Mackenzie's going to share when she begins. And then we will come up. If you have questions, you want to start putting them in the chat for our guests. But we're excited to hear from Marina.
Sure. I was prepared to talk about, or thinking that I would talk about what a set decorator does, what that job entails. But just like being so moved by everything that people have said before, I feel like I want to expound on that a little bit, or like echo in my life.
Should we stop sharing initially and then?
Sure.
Okay.
My life experience has been, very different in very many ways. But there are a lot of parallels, like a lot of what everybody said really resonated with me, in that I remember my dad telling me when he was constantly saying the world is made up of two types of people, it's X and Y, and they were always different. So obviously there's more than two types of people. But in his example, at this one point, it was there are people who know exactly what they want to do and they have goals and they go after them. And then there are people who are curious and explore something that they're interested in, and that leads to another experience or another opportunity, or another person comes into their life and they try that. And then, it's like really a path of exploration to figure out what it is that you want to do. And he was like, and you're the second type, which felt like a low-key diss at that point. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I had no idea set decorating was a career, and I think, though, to anybody who knows exactly what they want to do, and maybe even during the course of this conversation something resonates and that becomes a goal, like that is fantastic and admirable. And if you know what you want to do, then please tell everybody that you meet that's what you want to do, and then whoever can help you will help you. If you don't know what you want to do, that's terrifying, but it's also okay. And I think that it is, in my experience, it's so important to anything in your life that you enjoy, that makes your heart beat, that feels good to you, to be curious about that and to explore that, and to, whether it's taking a class or just carving out time in your personal life. Like for me, I always loved drawing. I always loved color. I always loved textiles and sewing. And none of those sound like careers, and it can feel almost silly, like, well, I'll get to that after I do my math homework or whatever I'm supposed to be doing. But also, and it can feel scary too, like to try something that is, what if I'm not good at it, But I think that if you spend time exploring things that feel meaningful to you, other opportunities will come to you. You'll meet other people that have similar interests. Someone will say, oh, if you like that, then what about this? And it's amazing how when you put your attention on things that are meaningful to you and you enjoy, even if they maybe feel flippant at the time, it can become profound, and opportunities will open up to you. Like I always, when I was a kid, I had to go to therapy to admit that I cared about beauty. Like it felt very superficial, maybe. But beauty isn't just tropical beaches and Instagram models. Like that's beauty to some people, but beauty is really anything that makes you feel grateful that you're alive, right? Like that really touches you. And so I think when I was the school that I went to when I was kindergarten through my senior year of college was ranked in the bottom 2% of the country So like not great. And I think that I held in my head, like as an 8-year-old, as a 12-year-old, as an 18-year-old, I had these two conflicting ideas that I held at the same time, which doesn't feel good, but I think everybody does that, right? Like there was, on the one hand, I believed that I was a powerful, talented person who was capable of great things. And then nobody around me like saw that, or necessarily believed that. But I knew, and I was like, I'm going to show them. But then on the other hand, I was filled with tremendous self-doubt and fear, which was like, I saw what was happening to everyone around me. My friends were getting pregnant and dropping out of school. People are going to prison. People were dying. Like that was just, or dropping out to work, which is, sometimes the right thing to do. But to mirror what Clint was saying, there was no clear path that I saw that was open to me. It wasn't like my dad could call up Universal and say, like, my daughter's great with color. You should give her an internship. And so I think that, for me, my parents were both the first from their generations to go to college, from their families. And my parents really believed in education as a path to self-exploration and self-knowledge and self-empowerment and improving your station in life and contributing to the world. And so I inherited that, and I worked really hard to go to school and didn't know when I got to school what I wanted to study. And it was a similar, like I think everybody before me has described, when something feels right, then you kind of gravitate to that and explore that. And maybe it isn't quite right, and then you explore something else. And so I think that curiosity, and that courage that it takes to explore something that feels right to you, even if it isn't what you're being told you should do, or it doesn't sound serious, like law or being a doctor or an accountant. And maybe that feels great, then that's perfect. But I think it's really important to be flexible and to reflect on what you like, and then to really make time for that in your life so that it can continue to find you. But yeah, I think should I talk about what set decoration is, or should we move into questions? Or
you know what? No, yeah, let's just give a little bit. But
okay.
But I think the direction that this has gone is much more important, because it's much more organic and it's much more true to what you guys want to share with our students. So that's excellent. But yes, I would love to hear a little bit about set decoration, and you let us know if we should share or not.
Okay, sure. So just very briefly, when I got out of college, I didn't know what I was going to do, and I waited tables to make a living and interns during the day at editing and documentaries. That was where I started off, documentaries. And then what I loved about documentaries is that you have an idea of what it's about or what you're interested in, what you want to explore. And then you interview people and you get footage, but the story changes. The story like unveils itself to you as you go, and you have to be willing to kind of reframe how you were thinking about it. Documentaries did not pay well, and I eventually gravitated into staged film and eventually gravitated into the art department, which was very visual and involved all of these elements that I had been attracted to when I was a kid, right? Like the color and form, and but also the storytelling of documentaries. What set decorators do, and it's very complicated, it's kind of nuanced, all of these positions, and even people in our industry don't understand all of the differences. But basically everything inside of the architecture, the set decorator deals with in tandem with the production designer. And that includes, in New York, that includes flooring and rugs and wallpaper and light fixtures, all of the furniture, all of the artwork. But all of that is it's creating a physical world that tells the story. And I think that in many cases, it's really about taking the character and figuring out who they are, and then figuring out what things they might have that helps tell that story, what they're interested in, what they're fearful about. Like, and I think the easiest way to think about that might even be to think about yourself. If you were the star of your own film, which you are, what things do you have in your space, and what do they say about you? How do they illustrate your interests? How do they illustrate your fears? Like, if you think about your parents' house, did they get their furniture when they got married? Are there pieces from your grandmother there? Are there pieces of furniture or dishes or a quilt that she sewed? Are there, what is the artwork on the walls? How is that meaningful? Who created it? Why were those pieces chosen? Or were pieces that are more, you know, in quarantine, did someone get a big TV because you're spending lots of time watching TV? Are there plants? Have they been growing for years? Or are they dead? Like, it's not all about beauty. It is actually about the specificity of the details that tell the story. And a dead plant in the corner is not necessarily disparaging. That's just like, you didn't have time to water that plant, or your radiator was going and you didn't have control over it. But I think when we're watching movies, I hear it all the time. People aren't necessarily aware of the backgrounds. They're thinking about the actors, but they're feeling all of that. That is all contributing to telling the story. And even spaces that don't have, like, you know, like an Alien, there's a big space and there's water dripping from the ceiling, and it is echoey and it is empty and it is eerie, and there are chains hanging from the ceiling and you don't know what's going on. Sigourney Weaver's not there. There's no alien there, but you know something bad is about to happen. And that is the story being told by the set, right? So I think that like the psychological aspect that is involved in being a set decorator, you're like a little detective where you're starting with the character, starting with the story, and then figuring out what are the right pieces to tell that story around them. And so for me, that's one of the parts that is really fun about it. There are also logistic parts where moving very quickly and you have to figure out how to problem solve. You have to, like, Tony and I worked on Marvel, not movies, but TV shows. Tony. And they, in those cases, like, people were always going to prison, people were always going to hospitals. And it is tough to, like, the industries that create prison furniture, it's always got soft corners, right? Nothing hard that you can hurt yourself with. It's always connected. The seats are connected to the table so that nobody can hit each other with a chair. But to get that stuff, like, prisons are normally built over the course of 5 to 10 years, right? And we would call up and need it in a month. And that the industry is not like, they weren't prepared to respond to us that quickly. And the same is true of hospitals or any institutional space. So there's a lot of problem solving that you're doing. You have to be very creative about, like, how to really get things done. And you're also like running a small business. You're overseeing the budget, you're managing a huge number of people, you're working creatively with the other departments. So there are all these facets to what set decorators do. But I feel like I'm going on.
That was perfect, beyond perfect. I'm gonna before we start our Q&A, I'm just gonna go back to Judy, and I want to know if you feel that you're doing what you love, and if not, is there a plan to do what you love, or to love what you're doing right now?
I think that's a good question. Thanks for asking it. You know, every project is different. And I think after 25 years in the industry, you know, in the last 5 to 7 years, I have to say, have changed a lot. So, you know, for me, the priorities have changed. It's really more about who am I going to be working with in terms of the producer and the director, who's the studio, how do they view the creative process? Are you considered a foe or friend? So it's become much more.
Judy, these sounds like conversations that we just had about a month ago, but I'll stay quiet.
We'll continue to have those conversations. So for me, I've become much more selective, and it's specifically post-pandemic. Life is short. I lost a couple of people, and it's just like everything came up for review, and it's like, what's really important? Am I going to be valued? What is the process I bring to the table going to be valued and supported? I left a pretty high profile film, because I was not being supported, and what I was being asked to do was close to impossible. And, this idea that we're just going to soldier through, we'll get through it and it's going to be okay. And I'm not doing that anymore. I do a lot more investigating before I sign on the dotted line and before I take any projects. It's not just for me, it's for all my departments. It's for the set deck department, it's for construction, it's for scenic, it's for graphics, it's for the set designer. I want to make sure that all those things are in place before I sign on. And I feel like the people who are making these budgets are not that realistic, some of them. I think there are few far in between that value and understand what things cost and what it'll take to have those visions materialized. So to answer your question, I still love what I do, but I'm much more selective in how I make a living at doing what I do. I take much more time in between projects. I don't go back-to-back jobs anymore. Back to the idea, Clint, of self-care, that's become much more important. And I think it's also not just post-pandemic, because I'm getting older. Like, how do you want to spend your time? Really, it becomes about those valued, because tomorrow's not guaranteed. Really, all you have is today. So how do you want to spend today? Who do you want to spend it with? Who do you want to surround yourself with? And do they value you? That's really the bottom line. So what I would say to the kids starting out is, and I don't mean to call you kids, young adults, sorry, it just shows my age, is that always make sure that you are valued. And that's not to say that they're not going to ask you to work hard. I'm not afraid of hard work. I've always, worked my part, but at the end of the day, I understand now, and I did earlier on, I just didn't speak up. I understand now that you can say, no, this is not for me, or this is what I need. Otherwise, it's not really doable. Instead of them looking at you like, well, I've never had those requests before. Really? I think you have. So my patience has gotten a little thinner. My detective skills on character and background of how they treat their crew has become much more fine-tuned. But to answer your question, Tony, yes, I still love what I do. I'm much more selective.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. Brandon. And Brandon, while you're unmuting yourself, I want everybody to know that I texted Brandon yesterday morning after I saw West Side Story on 68th and Broadway, and I texted actually Brandon, Zach Zerlin, who was the graphic designer. I texted them together because I took photos in front of Paul Tazwell's costumes that were on the corner of the AMC building. It was awesome. Please, everybody, go see it. Very excited. Deb Jensen was the supervising art director, so a lot of ETDM was represented on that film, and I'm grateful. So
yeah, thanks, Tony. Appreciate that. Yeah, shout out to Deb Jensen for sure. She was awesome. She's the one that brought me on board. Her and Adam Stockhausen brought me on board West Side Story, and has definitely also served as a mentor for me as well, along with Tony. So. Yeah, much appreciated. So Tony, your original question was, do you love what you do? Was that it? Absolutely. I took a lot of chances to try to get to this point. And, as I mentioned before, the path that was kind of told in my home that I needed to go to was this kind of, very directed, you're going to be successful if you're a lawyer, or if you're a doctor type path. And anything kind of going down a creative avenue was viewed more as, well, there's no guarantee in that. And, you know, you could end up a starving artist. And, you know, we struggled financially, like in my home growing up. And so this idea of, you know, coming from Nigeria to the States and then making a decision that kind of pushes you to fail in terms of, you know, this idea of failure or success in life was a big point of fear in my home, especially because my parents experienced certain degrees of what they perceived as that directly. And so I have to love this because, you know, this is, I kind of put everything on the line to get to this point. Now it's still evolving. I have to admit, had I not gone to architecture school, I did always have an interest in film, but had I not gone to architecture school, I don't know that I would have ended up going the route of doing, you know, set design and, you know, hopefully eventually maybe production design. You know, I was actually more geared towards, you know, Steven Spielberg was one of my, you know, childhood heroes. It was Steven Spielberg and Michael Jordan, you know, like, so I might have gone that avenue, but the way that this has kind of led me in is something that's much more specific to the details of my life and kind of the path to this point. So I love it, but I also understand that because it's taken so many turns that there's much more. This is part of it. And where it'll be years down the road from now, you know, if I'm fortunate, I have no idea. So anyway, just to answer your question, I love it, but there's more, and I'm open to opportunities to continue to come up.
Sorry, Clint, do you love what you do?
Yeah, no, I love what I do. You know, I mean, I wouldn't be doing it this long if I didn't love it. You know, I think everybody has said it already. I think, you know, it's also a privilege to get to do it, you know. So I feel like I think that to me is important, you know. But I think one of the things that Judy had said is really important, you know, for me. It's like, I think particularly coming out of this pandemic, I too left a big movie, like in the middle of it. Like I was like, no more, you know, and I was doing costumes for that. And particularly if you do costumes, you know, sort of a department that's, you know, traditionally populated by women and queer people, you know, like the amount of disenfranchisement that happens in that department is really crazy. But anyway, I digress. I have to say that, you know, I think there are, you know, I get irritated by the everyday, I think, but, you know, I love the long haul. I love what we're doing sort of like philosophically. And I actually, I'm loving thinking about how to make it better, how to make it, you know, how to make it more accessible, how we can share that love somehow, you know, because it's always been kind of like rarefied, right? It's always been sort of like this thing. And, you know, and in as much as we all said that there's really kind of like no clear path, I do feel like there's so much knowledge that, and lived experiences that still have to be shared, you know. And I think part of what happened during the pandemic is that we were actually privileged enough to pause and think about all of these things that we value, right? And I think we are forever changed. You know, we come out of it, you know, forever changed. And I think also to not acknowledge right now, I think, right, like as we're working, to not acknowledge that we are changed people is literally some form of violence for me, right? So I think my love is never unconditional for it. You know, it's always conditional. It's like I love what I do, but it also has to do things for me.
Thank you, Clint. Marina.
Yeah, I feel very similar. I do love what I do. I do feel incredibly grateful to be able to tell stories, to be able to make a living, working with aesthetics, to be able to create things that hopefully like touch other people and move them and are meaningful to them. I was working on the Many Saints of Newark when the pandemic hit, and I gave up my apartment when the pandemic hit, and then I had to come back because it was one of the first jobs back, and it was really tough. It was really tough working in that environment. I recently was offered a job that I loved the story, loved the cast, but would have required me to move to Cincinnati in winter and COVID times, and they weren't giving me the support staff that I needed. And I decided, like really big names, really story that I believed in, but it wasn't worth it if I wasn't going to be supported. And I have hurt my health by overworking, and I don't want to do that. I think it's important to find a balance, and just like Judy said, I think a lot of that is working with people who are respectful, who are talented, who set boundaries. I think the studios, there's so much content being created, and they're trying to create it so quickly, and have this cinematic level of content on TV budgets and timelines, and that's really tough. So I think that I really appreciate, communities like this where we're trying to support each other, and also, we're trying to create an environment that is sustainable for the next people who come along, who are to make it more sustainable, to make it
You guys have all, all four of you guys are inspiring to me personally, but I can only imagine. Thankfully we recorded, because Tony didn't know how to let people in the waiting room, so my apologies big time. So we will be sharing this, but before we move forward, I want to bring Liz in on the discussion and ask if she has more questions for our guests.
Yeah, we don't have any in the chat, but if any of you want to get a little last minute question in, please feel free to put it in the chat. And I did have one question. I'm just dying to know, Brandon, how your parents feel now.
Oh, that's
I
funny.
went through the same thing as you.
Yeah. Well, if the just in hindsight, they're very proud. It's funny. I had, and again, this is like a cultural thing, but I had this was maybe a couple of years ago. It was funny. So even me as an architect, before I got into film, I remember meeting. My father was in New York, and we were meeting with his buddies from college that lived there, and he was introducing me and kind of telling him a bit about me. And he said, "This is my son. He's an architect. He could have been an engineer, but he's an architect." And it's so funny. So it's like, okay, well, whatever. This is how the conversation goes. But so going even further into the creative process, going into film, I was like, okay, I'm just making this move on my own. There's cultural things where, you honor your father and your parents, and you listen to them, and you don't push back too much against, their direction, because they know what's best for you. But a few years ago, having a conversation with the same friend, I hear this come up, and he says, yeah, he's working a film now, he's doing very well with it. I'm really, really happy. I kind of support, I gave him permission to do that. It's kind of a joke, but I'm kind of like, oh, really? This was your idea, huh? This was, you were all the way behind this. So anyway, it's kind of a laughing point at this point. They're obviously very proud and very happy that I decided to kind of follow my own, follow my own direction on this. But there is kind of like that funny point of it being acknowledged through humor, kind of, as in like, I know you were right type of mentality. So, yeah.
Thank you. Tony, we have 10 minutes left, so maybe you want to direct your wonderful guest to do some closing remarks, a few minutes. Oh, wait a minute, there is one question, and we better address it. Sorry, from Stefan. He has a question for everyone, and this can be your closing remark. Was there ever a moment during a project where the director or studio's artistic vision clashed with your artistic vision, and how were both parties able to move forward and resolve that? I think that's a great closing comment.
And can I ask, if possible, because you guys each have talked about projects you might have walked away from, if there are projects that you stayed with about, if you can direct it towards that, hey, Clint, I mean, come on, like if there's projects that you could talk about that you were able to stay on the project and resolve, if that makes sense, to keep it positive. Whoever would like to go first. I'm not calling.
I'll go because
Okay.
I feel like, I mean, there's so many positive projects. You know what I mean? Like Respect is one of them. I think one of I want to address what the sort of the artistic differences, right? And it's always about dialogue, right? Like you are for me at least, right? Like it's always like it's dialogue, and it's also science, right? And so I think part of one of the things that it seems to always be, I don't know why it seems to be like every production approaches it like as if it's a new thing. It's like if you want 10 apples and one apple is $1, then you're gonna have to give me $10. Right? Like, so it's simple math, right? But in terms, so that's one side of the argument, right? And then the other side of the argument is like, well, I know you're telling me that it would cost this much, and that vision will cost this much, but can we actually do this, right? So that it wouldn't cost that much. And I think part of that is like, to me, is a dialogue, right? And I personally, I love it when they come to me with the problem and not the solution. It's always like, whether it's artistic or financial or anything like that, like, it's like, oh, I don't know, somehow that particular choice doesn't feel right to me. And I think, and you operate on a creative level as opposed to like, hey, can we just get rid of that chair? But why? Like I want to know what that frame of mind is, so I can actually maybe offer a solution that might be more interesting, or another solution that you may not have thought of. On the flip side, there are so many things that I do not know. And there are so many things that I have not lived through, right? So there are many things that I probably don't have an idea about, right? And so when a note or when an artistic note comes through, I've kind of like forced myself and trained myself to really stop, to just stop and not react, you know what I mean? And like give it a breath and think about it. And so I always just say, oh, yes, let me think about it, or yes, like, yeah, I understand. And then kind of ask more questions, right? Like I always find that asking more questions prevents me from saying stupid shit. Like I always just basically, okay, so what would that look like to you? Right? Like I would always just ask that because I want them to start talking to themselves too. You know what I mean? Having the same dialogue that I ultimately will have after the conversation, because I'll be talking to myself, like, blah, 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 blah. But like I want them to actually start thinking the way I'm thinking. You know what I mean? In that way. So it's always like a back and forth. And just in terms of like the final thing that I was going to say, and I know, Tony, that I think a lot of what we're talking about here, and part of the title was like the money will come, and sometimes it doesn't look like the money will come, and sometimes the money doesn't come. But I'm just gonna say, everything passes. Everything passes, right? Like I think part of sort of the privilege of doing this is that we actually get to say to ourselves, hey, I'm not gonna participate for this period of time, right? And there are consequences to that, right? Or you can say, I'm gonna participate for 5 years. You know what I mean? And there are consequences to that too, So all I'm saying is that I think, particularly in film, if you work, there's money to be made, right? But I think all the intricacies of how you work and what's important to you, you're gonna have, for me, I figured that out, and I'm still figuring that out.
Thank you. Who else would like to discuss the resolutions and the resolutions to differences?
I have a really kind of specific and almost simple example. If you could pull up that picture of the greenhouse, the conservatory.
Mackenzie, do you hear?
Or actually, I think, Tony, it's in the original.
Oh, Sorry,
What?
she's good. It's from Dickinson, which, so it's Emily Dickinson with a lot of beautiful flowers. Is it in this?
Yeah, I think it is at the very end. Sorry, these were examples of like things that weren't pretty, but that were lots of detail. No, maybe it's not.
Okay,
Sorry.
it's okay. Mackenzie, if you stop sharing, I think I'm gonna try to find it for her. Sorry.
So in this picture, it's really just a woman in a greenhouse, Emily Dickinson in a greenhouse reading, and the showrunner really, really wanted her, Emily Dickinson, to be lying on the ground, and it was that felt uncomfortable to me and difficult to shoot. And so what happened was I asked her to explain. A lot of times what you're doing is this detective work to understand what someone is really wanting behind the request. She really wanted, it turns out she wanted for her body to be horizontal. And that was an allusion to like the finale of a previous season. And she really wanted, the women are in corsets, and that is incredibly uncomfortable for them. And it's very difficult for them to look comfortable. And so she wanted her to look cozy. Like all that happens in this entire episode is she's reading a book. And then there are these fantasy sequences where she goes into New York with Walt Whitman in a Civil War hospital, and she goes to an underground bar and there are mermaids. But what happens in the real world is she's reading this book all day, Leaves of Grass. And I suggested a day bed in order to get her to be horizontal, but also like lift her up off the ground. And there was so much resistance to that, but we ended up staging it and getting an assistant set decorator to stand in so we could show them what that might look like, and getting the DP to give feedback, and eventually the showrunner. We got all these pillows so that she could be comfortable and cozy, and blankets, to create this atmosphere that we would hopefully want to settle down and read in. And ultimately, I think it was so much more successful to have her raised up in a bed than it would have been on the ground. And yet we were able to speak to and resolve like what was really important to her about it being a cocoon-like space where she could really sprawl out.
Absolutely beautiful. Any other resolutions? Yes.
I could say one. This is kind of less specific to a certain decision about design, how it's more so kind of a process thing where, you know, there was kind of a big culture shock for me getting into to entertainment design, in the way of the process of, you know, how it convey information. Was coming from kind of this corporate world of standardization where, you know, everyone kind of does it the same way. And it's this very specific way that this company has learned to develop how they produce their drawings or their imagery. And something that was kind of a big learning curve for me, where I met points of kind of conflict, was in, you know, every art director, every production designer I've been fortunate to work with kind of has a different way of conveying information, or a different kind of set of standards for how they want their drawings to look. I remember Tony, for example, going to work for Tony. Tony's very specific about how she wanted her drawings. And, you know, I remember kind of the first bit of time when I was, you know, kind of giving her progress drawings to take a look at, she would provide comments in terms of, you know, okay, what you've done here for the set's fine, but how you dimension this, the color, you know, the alignments, things of this sort, and how it's conveyed needs to be very specific to how this works, you know. So that was kind of an eye opener for me in going from project to project. What works for one art director or designer doesn't work for another. And the resolution was kind of setting my own kind of ego aside, where it's like, well, I think it should be done like this, and then kind of bumping heads, which I'm sure Tony kind of got from me at first. So I'm like, no, I'm going to do it like this. And she says, no, you're doing it like this. This is how it goes. I'm like, oh, okay.
You changed. It was much better.
But what's that?
I said you changed it. It was much better.
Yeah. But really kind of sitting down and having that conversation if there is a conflict in terms of how the drawings are being shown, and kind of talking through it in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and with what the construction team you're working with is and how they kind of interpret drawings and how they like to work. And anyway, so that now I come in expecting that if I'm working with a new team. And it's a conversation that I kind of like to have when we first start sharing drawings with each other in terms of what the best way to go about this is, and make sure that we're all on the same page so that we're not bumping heads on kind of our process.
Excellent. Excellent. Judy, did you have a quick comment? Because we're at our time limit.
Yes, I'll just expand on what Marina was talking about, which is you don't always have the luxury, but I do find that it works to help them visualize, because it is amazing how many people in our industry do not know how to visualize or can't visualize. So you can't take it for granted that they are understanding the concept when you first have these discussions. So I think anything from like pre-concept drawings to laying out furniture on a stage with tape lines of where the walls are going to be, then they start to understand, oh, that's why you want the window there, or that's why you want the ceiling height the way you do, or that's why you want a day bed instead of her being on the floor. When you can actually lay it out on paper, on a screen, whichever way you can help them visualize, I find that then they finally see what it is that you're trying to flesh out or detail, in how it's going to be more interesting visually or more cinematic, or it'll be better for lighting, or all these other things that, so that's one way that you can resolve these differences, because you can't assume that they can visualize. And that is something basic that I think you can't assume that everyone can do.
Excellent. Excellent. I just really want to thank each one of you guys. It's been lovely. Your honesty today, and maybe even redirection in the midst of the honesty, was refreshing, and I truly just appreciate every one of you guys. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Jane Muskie.
Hey everyone, thank you so much. It was a wonderful conversation. I think the way Judy ended it was sings to me, because I think that all of you young people listening should understand that what we all do is something that a lot of producers, directors, whatever, don't really understand, but they need us. And so we spend a good portion of our day trying to help them understand how to get the look or the set or the effect or the car or whatever that they need to move the production along. And sometimes it's a big secret. So the more craft you have, the more training you have, the more you're able to help them understand this. And it sounds silly if you're working with a very big director and you're trying to help them understand something, but it happens all the time. So you have a wonderful group here that I think are showing you that through time and energy, they're able to carry on the craft of what we're all very much involved in, and actually love quite a bit, even though sometimes it is hard to get up at 4:30 in the morning every day. Okay, Tony, thank you. What a wonderful time.